Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the third season of the LCLC podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Biberman. This third season is devoted to my continued investigation into the flights of thought, particularly humanistic thought, from the shelter of the American Academy into alternative spaces. I do so in order to further my work as LCLC director, so that I can continue to shape the conference, so that it can remain operative as a premier event for poets, writers, critics, scholars, academics, and intellectuals interested in making sense of art, literature, and culture today. In this episode, my guest is Sam Vaknin, professor of clinical psychology and the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, first published in 1999 and now in its 10th edition. Sam and I began our wide-ranging conversation with me sharing an old joke with Sam about English professors and the worth of the things they like to discuss. Hi, Sam. My first question goes back to an old joke that I remember when I was a master's student in English literature at NYU in the late 80s, and that was that English departments are where dead ideas go to live on. And specifically what people meant was Marxism at the time, because we were in this sort of pause of the end of history and Marxism had been discredited and only English professors were stupid enough to keep talking about it. And until queer theory really rose, people seemed to feel the same way about Freud, that Freud had been totally discredited and that we were going to have better living through chemistry and antidepressants, and that only foolish English professors continued to do any of that stuff. But as you and I are talking now in 2024, both of those dead thinkers have come roaring back, at least in where I live within the humanities. So my first question is, why do you think humanist academics continue to work with psychoanalytic terms and theories, doing something that I think Freud called early on in an essay, wild psychoanalysis? Shouldn't these approaches be focused on individuals, on analysis and therapy and mental healing? What is the point of doing psychoanalytic cultural critique for you?
Psychoanalytic theory, well, first of all, thank you for having me. It takes courage, perseverance, and patience, and you have displayed all three. Psychoanalytic theory is useless as an efficacious psychotherapy. And it relies on foundations which are at best shaky, such as recovered memories, the delayed effects of allegedly traumatic events, the concept of abreaction, coupling affect with recall, and of course, the overwhelming sexual etiology of trauma. So all these foundations are, and I'm using a British understatement and I'm being very charitable as one Jew to another, all these foundations are a bit shaky. As a therapy, it might as well have been discredited. I think it was the right thing to do. But it is very useful as an organizational hermeneutic principle. It makes sense of the world. It imbues life with meaning. Freud's late focus on meaning was kind of harbinger of later schools in psychology. Freud himself, Jung, Adler, they all applied psychoanalytic theory to civilization, civilization and its discontents, totem and taboo, etc., to history, to culture, to society. And I think they've shown the way. By the end of his career, Freud was much more focused on analyzing society and culture, social processes, civilizations, and so on and so forth, than on the individual and the alleged mind of the individual. So he has shown the way, in effect.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we ended up well. I think we ended up with the benefits of psychoanalytic theory and without its more show business aspects or performative aspects.
Okay, I can go along with that. A side question for you then is I uh, gained awareness of you and your theories through YouTube, and you are much better at that than I am. So, in a certain sense, you're a role model for me to aspire to.
Oh my
But
God, I've never been a role model before. Okay.
but you often present videos designed to appeal to individuals who are seeking therapeutic assistance. Why do you do that?
I am not a member of the psychoanalytic fraternity. I'm utterly eclectic. For example, one of the main influences of my work is social learning theory, Bandura. I'm even partial to behaviorism. So I wouldn't say that I'm a Freudian. Definitely not. I'm definitely not a Jungian. I borrow and I collect and I assemble concepts which I find useful, and I'm absolutely not I don't have an allegiance or an affiliation or loyalty to any specific school.
When I continued on in my doctoral work, and I did that at Duke University in the mid and late 90s, and studied with a bunch of luminaries. Yves Sedgwick was there, Stanley Fish was there, Fred Jameson was there, at least in the world of literary studies. These are big names. And although with varying degrees of affection, all of them felt the need to come to grips not just with the Freudian legacies that we're beginning to talk about, but very specifically with the ways in which Lacan engaged with Freud and under a kind of banner of back to Freud, uh, took the Freudian inheritance really somewhere else into Lacanianism. And as you and I are talking in 2024, I think a lot of people are astounded that of all of those sort of titans of French theory, a strong argument could be made now that Lacan has emerged as the most significant in terms of persisting influence. Why do you think Lacan has had this staying power?
I think Lacan created a psychology of loss, whereas Freud's psychology was centered around the concept of trauma and therefore was essentially an optimistic theory, because Freud said that trauma can be handled, can be managed, can be coped with. Trauma can be reframed. Trauma can be brought to the surface together with the attendant affect or emotion, and then healing occurs spontaneously. Freud's work was optimistic, that's the irony, although the guy himself was very cynical and pessimistic. But Lacan was the first to cope, I think, and much more seriously than Freud has ever done, with the issue of loss. Lacan postulated, of course, the three realms, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. And Lacan said that the transition from the imaginary to the symbolic, in other words, the transition from introspection and self-preoccupation to language, or in the use of language, and then the mediation of the world via language. He said that this inevitable transition, it's a childhood transition, this inevitable transition involves tremendous loss. The loss of the pre-verbal world, the loss of fantasy and the ability to fantasize, the loss of big parts of the primordial or primitive unconscious, etc., etc. So Lacan was a philosopher of loss. He even said that the real is inaccessible, is utterly beyond our reach. It's not a domain that we inhabit. And so Lacan combined surrealism in a way, because when you say that the real is inaccessible, you're being surrealistic. Surreal, yeah. So he combined surrealism, he combined loss, he dealt with childhood in a way that no one has ever done before. And so many of the themes that Lacan has developed are very modern themes, very, I would even say, postmodern themes. And so he's much more suited to modernity than I think Freud is. Freud represented bourgeoisie Vienna, fin de siècle, end of the century Vienna, which was the bourgeoisie, the emerging middle class and the middle class values and so on and so forth. And that world is long dead and gone. Lacan's world is chaotic. It's a dreamscape. It's surrealistic in the bad sense. It's about loss. It's about terror. It's about your inability to perceive yourself directly, for example, by watching yourself in a mirror. You have to use language as a mediator. And then you're confronted with the limitations of language and with the corruption of language and with the ability to manipulate language in order to yield evil outcomes. So Lacan is also a philosopher of evil. Now, Slavoj Žižek, who is the greatest Lacanian of them all nowadays, Slavoj Žižek tried to inject some optimism into Lacan. He tried to reframe Lacan the way Lacan perhaps tried to reframe Freud. And so what Slavoj Žižek says is that we actually possess human agency. Slavoj Žižek introduced the idea of agency into the equation, into the Lacanian soup. And he said, we are the ones who construct the real. The real is just the interface between the symbolic and the imaginary. And we are in full control of this interface. In other words, what Žižek was saying is that we are godlike. Because if you create the real, you are a creator in the theological sense. You're a divine entity. And so Žižek is the philosopher of narcissism, with very strong undertones and overtones of Protestantism, actually. I will not go into it right now. But he's a philosopher of narcissism. Žižek not only did this, but Žižek rejected ideology, or the construct of ideology. He said that ideologies are compensatory confabulations, fantasies intended to mislead us and deceive us into believing that we're in touch with the real. But he said we don't need them. They are leading us astray. We don't need ideologies. We are the masters of the real. We are the creators of the real in the seam between imaginary and symbolic. Lacan would have been shocked, devastated, and probably would have committed suicide had he been exposed to Žižek's teachings, because Lacan was very adamant that there's nothing beyond the symbolic, there's nothing beyond language, and that language is not an encapsulation of the real. It's not even a representation of the real. It has nothing to do with the real. So there's a huge gulf or gap between Žižek and Lacan. While Žižek uses Lacanian language, ironically, he uses Lacanian language, he is absolutely not a purist Lacanian. He's more a Hegel guy.
Right.
And in this sense, just to finish the thought, in this sense,
Sure.
Žižek came up with a new version of Naturtheologie, the German idealist perception of the universe, and so he reinvented Naturtheologie by using Lacanian language. Very bizarre concoction. Žižek's work is very bizarre concoction.
Yeah, it's fascinating too. I often talk about Žižek, and I had I want to say privilege of publishing, I think it was his first essay on Shakespeare in a collection I did called Shakespeare After 9/11. that we may circle back around to when we get to our conversation about Queers for Palestine, because it models for him through a reading of Richard II, strangely enough, about traversing the fantasy. It was one of the first times I think that he applied that concept to a particular Shakespearean text. But I first encountered Zizek when he was hanging around Duke University at the invitation of Fred Jameson after The Sublime Object of Ideology had come out. And my joke about Zizek is that he's the last star of theory, you know, that there are no real stars of theory that after, because he comes in, right, 1989 is the publishing date of The Sublime Object, and that after that, my argument is that the baby boomer sort of star minting apparatus in the United States Academy anyway, largely stopped producing new ones because star status is not earned, it's conferred, and they didn't want to confer it. They wanted to confer it on themselves at that point, but we're not in a situation where any of that makes much sense anymore. But I have followed his career quite a bit, and I agree with your take that it is a radical appropriation of Lacan, and that it does go back to Hegel and really also Schilling and Schlegel and what you're talking about. Yeah, that
philosophy.
Yeah, right. It is a reintroduction of a kind of idealistic strand, oddly enough, in a postmodern context where somehow idealism can live again in a kind of changed reality. So the other question I had, where we in our notes in advance were talking about Zizek, was the ban on Jung. You talked about Jung for a minute, and that to me always gets to two things that we've kind of touched on. One is, particularly in now that we see a lot of conversation about the fall off of birth rates, and with the fact that current young people are having a lot less sex and a lot less kids, that the desire in the Freudian tradition to root everything into the sex drive, and Jung's disagreement about that, and then the desire to create some kind of notion that the unconscious of an individual extends in a very ascientific way, really, but I don't think Jung cared, beyond their bag of bones, so that we could begin to talk about a collective unconscious. And there's no way you can talk about a collective, but if you use the word social imaginary or something like that, then your piece in whatever peer-reviewed journal it is in the world of literature and humanities will get through. But you can't use Jung. You can't go into the idea of a collective unconscious, but in so many ways we want to. What do you make of that?
Well, the pedigree of the idea of the unconscious doesn't start with Freud, of course. Actually, Genet, who preceded Freud, Genet accused Freud of plagiarism openly in writing. And I regret to say that he was right. Freud's concept of the unconscious has to do with dissociation, 100%. And so in this sense, Freud is just copied Genet. By the way, he copied Genet verbatim. He copied the concepts, the words. In today's world, he would have been sued for copyright violations or infringements. So this was the Freudian plagiarism act of the Genet dissociated unconscious type. Whereas Jung disagreed with Freud on all major issues. It's very wrong to present Jung as a disciple of Freud. That ended after their first meeting. After Jung has met Freud for the first time, he said that he was so shocked by Freud that the father image of Freud has been ruined for him. Among other things, Jung discovered in his first meeting with Freud that Freud was two-timing his wife with her sister, for example. So that's not much of a father figure. So Jung divorced Freud mentally very early on. Now, Jung disagreed with Freud about narcissism. He disagreed with Freud about introversion. He disagreed with Freud about the formation of the self. He disagreed with Freud about everything. I have no idea why people group them together. And one of the things they had a major disagreement about is the unconscious. Whereas Freud initially, by the way, suggested that the unconscious is an utterly individual thing because he plagiarized Janet. Jung, ab initio, considered the unconscious as a bridge connecting the individual to a culture, to society, to a period in history, and to the past, above all else. Now, the social imaginary is acquired, it's non-universal, it's context-dependent, and it's a narrative. While Jung's collective unconscious is innate, so philosophically it's a part of the theory of innatism, so it's innate, it's hereditary, and it is universal. So the differences between the social imaginary and the collective unconscious are immense. I wouldn't compare them. They're not the same, absolutely not the same, which makes it much easier to accept the concept of social imaginary. The collective unconscious is deterministic, even one would say fatalistic, but definitely deterministic. It's hereditary in the strict genetic sense. Jung was talking about heredity, like genetics. And it's universal. Whether you're an African, an Asian, an American, whatever, you share the same collective unconscious. Now, this created severe problems because we have rejected determinism long ago because we wrongly associated it with religion. So the Enlightenment rejected the concept of determinism. When Newton came up with determinism in physics, Leibniz didn't spend a moment attacking him. And then we spent the next 300 years getting rid of Newton's determinism. Determinism was a taboo in modern science, in modern thinking, Enlightenment philosophies and so on, absolute taboo. And here Jung suggested a totally deterministic concept. There was instead an idolization of the individual as a maker, the individual as an auteur, the individual as a focus or the center. In Zizek's works as well. So this led to a process of scientism, the idolization of science itself, and of the individuals who make science, the scientist. And so there was an emphasis on empiricism, there was an emphasis on positivism, logical positivism, other positivism, and above all, there was an emphasis on external criteria such as falsifiability. So Jung's collective unconscious fails in this sense. It's not an empiricist concept. It is not subject to falsifiability, cannot be falsified. It's definitely not a positivist concept. It flies in the face of positivism. And because it's unfalsifiable and undecidable, it was excluded from the discourse. The same way no serious scientist would tackle the question, does God exist? It's an undecidable question, an unfalsifiable question. Similarly, the question of mind-body dualism, and even the question of string theories in physics. These are undecidables. These are unfalsifiable things. So they're relegated to the realm of mysticism or metaphysics, but they're not serious science and can never be considered serious science. And anything that is not serious science is not serious, period. So art and religion and mysticism and even philosophy, they're not serious because they're not serious science. And disciplines such as psychology, such as economics, such as sociology, they're trying to become sciences. exact sciences, because otherwise they will never be taken seriously. So Jung was swept along in this movement towards exact sciences, measurable, falsifiable, observable, quantifiable, etc., etc. That's why mathematics has become the lingua franca of a discipline which should never ever be mathematical, and that is a discipline of psychology. Why? Because it gives the appearance of exactitude. And you can't reduce the collective unconscious to anything mathematical. Although Lacan, by the way, did try to reduce his work to mathematics. I don't know if you're aware of that. Psychology in general has transitioned from a logical positivist phase where people were basically concerned with the brain. They did autopsies of the brain, they studied the brain and so on. So we have Wundt, we have Charcot. This was the first phase. Then psychology transitioned to the mind, to the study of the mind. So we have Freud and we have Jung. And then psychology transitioned to the study of populations or cohorts. Psychology became statistical and doomed the work of people like Freud and like Jung, but also people like Klein and Fairbairn and a million others, like whole treasures, 150 years of psychology all these treasures have been incinerated in the furnace of mathematical exactitude and laboratory studies, which go nowhere, by the way, because there is a replication crisis. What I'm trying to say, I think, is that Jung is one victim among many. And the problem is psychology, not Jung. Psychology has been corrupted and deformed beyond recognition and beyond measure. It's a pseudoscience. It's a mess. It's a circus act. It's not serious, really not serious now, you know. Now, ironically, exact science actually supports Jung. When you look at various branches of science, we definitely find very powerful indications of what might be called the collective unconscious, or the autonomous self, or whatever you want to call it. For example, in ethology, you have processes such as imprinting or innate release mechanisms. In linguistics, you have universal grammar, Chomsky, Pinker. In social psychology, you have what is known as social pre-wiring. There are amazing studies of twins as embryos, and they are much more social than selfish in the womb. So wherever you look, biology, sociology, economics, ethology, I mean, exact and less exact sciences, social sciences, humanities, the indications are overwhelming that Jung has actually been right, and that the unconscious is probably prefigured and preconfigured in some way, not necessarily with its contents. I think the major dispute with Jung is that he didn't just discuss templates. He discussed the contents of templates, the archetypes.
Right.
The archetypes are the problem. But the templates exist, ready-made containers, available, processes triggered on birth. I mean, this is beyond dispute, I think, nowadays. And in this sense, I think Fairbairn is much closer to modern scientific knowledge than Jung. But both Fairbairn and Jung agree that a baby is never born tabula rasa. It's never a blank slate. We are born with potentials, and these potentials are encoded in wetware in the brain and just waiting to be triggered or fulfilled or whatever. I think when Jung went into the territory of archetypes, he has abandoned probably science and moved into literature, the study of mythology, the study of religion, the study of... And I think this is why scientists are very angry at him and tend to ignore him.
Right. Well, that's very enlightening. I appreciate you going into that in the detail that you did. In terms of your own work and your specialization in narcissism, I wanted to ask you to take a moment and walk us through why you decided to make that, I think it's fair to say at some point, your life's work, and where your thoughts on it started, and to what degree there's been an evolution in your understanding of the concept, and the degree to which there might be ways to mitigate it, or I hesitate to say treat it, but that is perhaps the clearest way to ask the question.
Well, I don't want to emulate Freud. Every 5 years, Freud would write an autobiographical study, tracing his path and his evolution, self-aggrandizing. I have a very dim view of Freud. I think he was a genius, unmitigated genius. But he had so many flaws that cast in doubt our idealization of him. Anyhow, one of his flaws was this self-masturbatory self-preoccupation with his mental development. He thought he had to document every single step, thought, idea, conflict, and so on and so forth. And it's very self-indulgent. So I will not emulate him. Instead, I will tell you where I'm now. I mean,
Okay.
So I've reconceived of narcissism in 4 ways. And before I proceed to describe these ways as briefly as I can, I promise, I think that narcissism is a very important concept in psychology, possibly the root of everything. The root of personality theory, the root of mental illness, the root. So I don't think that narcissism is a single aspect or a single shard in the kaleidoscope. I think it is the kaleidoscope. I think psychology is about narcissism, only we call it different names, but I think it's all narcissism. Now, of course, if you're a carpenter, if you're a hammer, everything is a nail. Yeah, I mean, right. Normally. But I share this view with many much more important luminaries and scholars, and so I'm not alone in thinking this way. And it is a fact that narcissism has become by far the hot button topic in the current study of psychology. So I've reconceived of narcissism in 4 ways. Number 1, I suggest that narcissistic personality disorder is a post-traumatic condition. It's a post-traumatic condition and therefore should be amenable to trauma therapies. Our current mistake is we are trying to apply to narcissism treatment modalities which were never meant to deal with trauma. And so they keep failing, of course. I also suggest that the narcissist is a child. The mental and emotional age of the narcissist is, I don't know, anywhere between 2 and 4 years old, when separation individuation has stalled and there was a problem with the formation, constellation, and integration of the self. So at that point, there was what used to be called arrested development or stunted development or stunted thriving or whatever you want to call it. And the narcissist simply froze in time. And so it's a child. And so that's the second mistake we're making when we're trying to treat narcissists, where we apply to the narcissist adult psychologies, treatment modalities intended to cope and modify adults, when the narcissist is actually a child. So the first contribution I've made is to suggest that we should combine child psychology with trauma therapies in order to cope with narcissism. The second reconception, I suggested that the narcissist has a single exclusive mode of interacting with other people. In other words, the narcissist is confined to a single type of interpersonal relations, and that is known as the shared fantasy. Shared fantasy was first described by Sander in 1989. And I suggested that the shared fantasy is the only way a narcissist can interact and does interact with intimate partners, romantic partners, friends, colleagues, neighbors, you name it. All interpersonal relationships are mediated via a fantasy defense, writ large, all-consuming, all-pervasive, ubiquitous. Actually, the narcissist is a fantasy known as the false self. So I combined the shared fantasy with a principle that I came up with, the dual mothership. I suggested that at the core of the narcissist shared fantasy, there is an attempt to recreate an early childhood conflict, a failure in separation individuation, a failure to separate from the maternal figure and become an individual. And so the shared fantasy is used to recreate this conflict with a series of intimate partners, friends, and so on and so forth. And I call it the dual mothership because the narcissist regresses the partner, renders the partner infantile. And so the partner becomes the narcissist's mother, but the narcissist becomes the partner's mother as well. So it's like two mothers. And I call it mothership, not because I don't know English, I wish to believe, but because I want to imply that there's a kind of mothership in space that is in control of the, of the vehicles, so a dual mothership. The third reconception or reframing or rewriting of narcissism is when I suggested that narcissism is a failure at othering. Now, othering is a word that has bad reputation. It means, the rejection of the other, the demonization of the other. But in my work, othering simply means the ability to recognize the separateness and externality of other people. And I suggest that because narcissism is a very early age failure, pathological narcissism is a very early age failure in separation, the narcissist is incapable of perceiving other people's separateness. And because the narcissist never becomes an individual, there's no formation of an ego. Ironically, narcissists are egoless. They don't have an ego. So because of that, there's an othering failure. The narcissist is unable to relate to other people as external objects and as separate from himself because he has never gone through the experience of separation, individuation. And so the end result is something known as hyperreflexivity. It's a psychotic feature. And in this sense, I compare narcissism to psychosis. There's a confusion between internal and external objects, exactly like in psychosis. And in this, I'm a follower of Otto Kernberg, who has suggested basically the same. Mm-hmm. And finally, the fourth contribution is that I suggest that the only way to treat narcissism is to combine, as I said, trauma therapies with techniques borrowed from child psychology, but in a framework of re-traumatization. The narcissist needs to re-experience early childhood traumas, but not by verbalizing them or processing them, by actually reliving them, something known as revividness. Again, that's not my original contribution. That was suggested in 1985 by Foer in Nozak. But what I've done, I've taken these concepts and so on and so forth, and I've integrated them. So I have an integrated frame. Unlike Freud, I like to acknowledge sources. So I acknowledge the sources, but I think I've given them a new lease on life. I also created most of the language in use today. So that's another thing.
Right. Well, I think it's a very powerful model, and I think I agree with you that narcissism rests at the core of the endeavor itself of psychology and psychoanalysis. And one question that I want to ask, it may seem like a stupid question, but often those are the good questions, is it makes so much sense. The way you walk through it, it makes so much sense of something that is not sensical, in the sense that, in the old days, I'm a Shakespearean scholar by trade, he would have said we're talking about madness here. And what you've done is you've imposed a kind of sense on madness. Can that possibly be right? That is, that I'm skeptical of its truth because I find the truth so logical.
It's a very good question, and good question. It's not stupid at all, but it does rely on an erroneous foundation, on a hidden assumption that is utterly wrong. And that is a very common mistake among laymen. No offense, I'm a layman in Shakespeare.
Sure.
Yeah? Very common mistake among laymen to believe that madness equals chaos and sanity equals order or structure. It's a mistake committed by the likes of Jordan Peterson, I mean, who is ostensibly a psychologist. Yeah? So, and that is, of course, completely untrue. As numerous scholars have demonstrated, including a scholar I've met, Yehuda Fried, when I was very young, and had a huge influence on my work and on me. As numerous scholars have demonstrated conclusively, madness is an alternative structure, alternative order, alternative logic, paralogic. So it's not that madness is chaos. Madness is not your order. Madness is not your structure. And this is, of course, at the core of the work of people like Michel Foucault or like Thomas Szasz, or the anti-psychiatry movement. Because madness is not chaos. Actually, there is an excellent argument to make that many forms of madness have to do with rigid structures, an order that is ossified and that is constricting life because it's too algorithmic and too reducible to mathematics, if you wish. So many psychotics develop impeccable logics, internal logics, kind of private languages, if you wish, to borrow from Wittgenstein, but they develop impeccable logics and they impose these logics on observations, they're very scientific about it, and so on and so forth. So narcissism is one such thing. Kernberg suggested that narcissism is a defense against borderline emotional dysregulation, and therefore both narcissism and borderline are on the border of psychosis. That's why he called it borderline. It's on the border between neurosis and psychosis. I agree. Whereas the psychotic confuses internal objects with external ones, the psychotic believes that his internal objects, for example, internal voices, internal images, are actually external. The narcissist confuses external objects with internal ones. The narcissist would look at you and say, you're just a figment of my imagination, or you're just an internal object in my mind. He wouldn't say it because it's unconscious, but that's the way he would relate to you. That's why he would never accept your personal autonomy, your agency, your efficacy. He would reject this. He would fight it furiously because you are internal. If you display personal autonomy, you are a rebellious internal object, which threatens the precarious balance of the personality. But balance does exist. It's a mistake to think that psychosis, for example, is an unstable system. These are stable systems which incorporate internal instabilities and so on, but they are stable, they're rigid.
Mm-hmm.
If you open the DSM, by the way, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual,
right,
in the descriptions of many mental illnesses, narcissistic personality disorder included, they use the word rigid, a rigid personality.
Right. That is often when there is this perceived rebellion against the rigidity of the worldview, that's the moment when the aggressivity, the aggression, the rage, and the bad behavior of the narcissist comes to the fore that drives so many people, I think, to seek you out in terms of the quasi-therapeutic videos that you make that people use to understand the behavior that they're dealing with when they encounter toxic narcissists. My thanks again to Sam Vaknin for agreeing to participate in this podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a review, and even perhaps telling a friend or two. Most especially, we'd love for you to join us at an upcoming LCLC conference. To learn more, reach out to me directly, Matthew Biberman, or you can find details at thelouisvilleconference.com. Thanks again for listening.